Picture a winter dawn in northern Britain. The wind off the moors is sharp enough to sting the eyes, and a ribbon of Roman road disappears into mist. Somewhere beyond that gray horizon, men in segmented armor march in disciplined silence. 6,000 legionaries, plus camp followers, engineers, and cavalry attached to the column. Their standards catch what little light there is: an eagle, a bull, the proud number 9. Then, as if a curtain falls, the 9th Legion simply stops existing. For nearly 2,000 years, that gap has been one of Rome's most enduring mysteries. A legion was not a small detachment you could misplace. It was an institution with pay ledgers, supply contracts, veteran settlements, and a bureaucratic paper trail so thick you can almost hear the scratch of styluses on wax tablets. Roman officers wrote reports, governors wrote letters, emperors demanded numbers. And yet, Legio IX Hispana, the lost ninth, vanishes from the record sometime after the conquest of Britain. No surviving ancient author sits us down and says, "Here is what happened." Instead, we have silence, broken only by scattered stones, a few inscriptions, stamped tiles, and the faint shadow of a name that once terrified Rome's enemies. This series is a careful walk along the edge of that silence. We're going to follow the ninth from its earliest footsteps to the last solid traces we can date, and then we'll test the competing theories like a jury examining exhibits. Was the legion destroyed in the wild north of Britannia, swallowed by Caledonian forests and sudden ambush? Was it quietly transferred to the Rhine frontier, where another war consumed it far from Britain's headlines? Or did it end up in the eastern provinces, Syria, Arabia, Judea, lost in a conflict Rome preferred not to advertise? Most importantly, we'll ask a historian's question: what does each theory actually rest on? Not on romance, not on a single dramatic sentence, but on evidence. What's written, what's carved, what's missing, and what that absence might mean. Because the lost ninth isn't only a story about a disappearance. It's also a story about how history itself is made, from fragments, from accidents of survival, and from the uneasy truth that even great empires can lose track of their own legions. And in part 2, we begin where Roman military legends often begin, not in Britain at all, but in the brutal politics of the late Republic, when Caesar's world was still on fire. If you enjoy measured mysteries with real clues, you're in the right place. To understand why the ninth matters, you have to remember what a Roman legion really was. It was a moving city of men. Disciplined violence, yes, but also carpenters, surveyors, medics, clerks, and cooks. The legion's number was its identity, its pride, its reputation. Soldiers swore an oath to it. Veterans tattooed it into their memories. When a legion was destroyed, Rome felt it like a broken bone, and the emperors, who relied on legions for power, took such losses personally. The problem is that the ninth's earliest years are already half hidden behind the smoke of civil war. Many historians think the unit that became Legio IX was raised by Julius Caesar in Gaul, perhaps in the 50s BC, when Rome was still technically a republic and Caesar was building his personal army one campaign at a time. We can't prove every step. The sources from that era love heroic names and dramatic speeches, but they are frustratingly vague about payrolls and unit continuity. Legions could be disbanded, merged, or reconstituted under the same number. So when we speak of the ninth, we're following a thread that sometimes frays. Even so, a ninth appears in Caesar's world, and a ninth survives into the age when Rome becomes an empire. Under Augustus, legions are formalized, numbered, and stationed like chess pieces along the frontier. Their nicknames, Hispana, Victrix, Augusta, work like medals. The ninth acquires Hispana, which hints at service in Spain during the long, grinding campaigns that finally subdued the peninsula. A legionary surname is like a scar, proof you've been somewhere hard, somewhere the empire needed you. It does not necessarily mean the legion died there. It means it earned its name there and carried that story forward. Now picture recruitment in those years. Young men from Italy and the provinces step up, sign their names, or make a mark if they cannot write, and accept a life measured in drills, marches, and 25 years of obligation. They learn to build a fort in a single evening, to cook with one pot, to obey a trumpet call in the dark. Their world is the standard, the eagle at the center, guarded like a living god. By AD 40, the Roman map is vast, yet hungry. Britain is still outside direct imperial control, a foggy island that Roman politicians talk about as both prize and threat. Claudius, not the most confident emperor, wants a victory large enough to silence whispers about his legitimacy. The invasion of Britain will be his statement. Rome still expands. Rome still conquers. And so, in AD 43, the order goes out. Ships gather. Legions embark. Among them is the ninth, already old, already proud, already carrying decades of experience on its shoulders. In the next part, we land with them on the British coast, where the sea smells of kelp and fear, and where every step inland will be paid for in blood and mud. The Roman invasion of Britain was not a single dramatic battle. It was a process: tides, supply lines, weather, and the stubborn refusal of local tribes to behave like conquered people. In AD 43, the invasion force crossed the Channel in waves, landing on a coast that looked familiar only in the sense that all coasts are cold and uncertain when you arrive under arms. The ninth came with veterans who had seen other provinces pacified, and recruits who were discovering what it meant to march all day and then dig a ditch all night. Rome's first objective was speed: build forts, secure river crossings, break the tribal coalitions before they could learn how to fight the legions together. Ancient writers give us a commander, Aulus Plautius, and a political climax, Emperor Claudius himself arriving later to claim the victory, parading elephants and prestige. But the men on the ground lived a different rhythm. The long haul of campaigning, the wet leather, the ache in the shoulders from carrying a pack that never feels lighter. Ancient narratives give us names: Cativalani, Trinovants, and a few set-piece clashes at rivers like the Medway and the Thames. Yet the real story is logistics. A legion's power was not just the thrust of a pilum. It was the ability to stay fed, shod, and supplied in hostile territory. Roads pushed forward like veins. Timber turned into palisades. Clay became tiles stamped with unit marks, the quiet fingerprints of the army. When archaeology finds those stamps, 9, the mark of a legion, it is like hearing a footstep in a corridor that has been silent for centuries. Somewhere in those early years, Londinium begins to grow, a trading settlement at a key crossing of the Thames. It is not yet the grand London of later centuries, but it is already a place where Roman order tries to take root. Merchants, officials, soldiers, and enslaved laborers, all sharing narrow streets that smell of smoke and wet wool. The ninth would have passed through such places, sometimes as conquerors, sometimes as builders, always as the empire's visible edge. By the late 40s and 50s, Roman authority spreads, but it is brittle. A governor can win a battle and still lose the province if he misreads the politics of tribute, hostages, and local pride. Legions are rotated, deployed, and repositioned like heavy pieces. The ninth spends years in Britain, holding ground while Rome learns what this island demands. And then comes the lesson every empire eventually learns: conquest is not the same as control. In Part 4, the province erupts in one of the most violent rebellions Rome ever faced, a rising led by a queen named Boudica. In that firestorm, the ninth steps into the story as more than a name. It becomes a target. By AD 60, Britain looks calm on a Roman map. Roads connect forts. Taxes flow. Veterans retire onto allotments. The governor, Suetonius Paulinus, is even campaigning far away in Wales, striking at the island of Mona, Anglesey, where Roman writers imagined a center of Druidic resistance. In Rome, such signs would read as success. In Britain, they read as overconfidence. The spark is political and brutally personal. When King Prasutagus of the Iceni dies, Roman officials move to absorb his kingdom. Ancient accounts describe property seized, nobles humiliated, and Prasutagus' widow, Boudica, publicly flogged while her daughters are assaulted. Whether every detail survives accurately is debated, but the pattern is plausible, and the result is not. A rebellion so vast and sudden that it makes Roman order look like thin ice. Camulodunum, modern Colchester, burns first. Londinium follows, and then Verulamium. The archaeology of those towns contains a red layer of destruction, a horizon of fire. Roman civilians flee along roads that suddenly feel like traps. And in the middle of this chaos, the Ninth Legion meets the Rising in the worst way possible, not as a full legion in battle formation, but as a force caught out. The commander associated with the Ninth at this moment is Quintus Petilius Cerealis. He marches to relieve Caledonia, but he arrives too late, and he arrives on ground chosen by his enemies. The sources tell us that the Ninth's infantry is cut down. Only the cavalry, faster and less pinned in the killing zone, breaks through and escapes. If you want to picture the scene, think of Roman discipline colliding with a storm, a narrow road, woods on either side, shouting, dust, then the sickening realization that shields and drills are useless when the line is shattered before it forms. This matters for our mystery for two reasons. First, it proves the Ninth could suffer catastrophic losses and yet continue to exist. A legion's death is not always a single moment. It can be a wound, then a refilling, then another wound. Second, it gives the Ninth a reputation in Britain that lingers. To the rebels, the Ninth is vulnerable. To Rome, the Ninth must be rebuilt, and Rome does rebuild it, because Rome cannot afford to leave that number, that symbol, bleeding on the ground. Suetonius eventually crushes the revolt in a decisive battle. But the province is changed. Rome becomes more cautious, more fortified, more aware that Britain can turn feral without warning. And in Part 5, we follow the rebuilt Ninth northward to a new base at Eboracum, York, where the frontier is not a line on a map, but a living, dangerous edge. Stand on the banks of the River Ouse and imagine York not as a tourist city, but as a military machine. In the late 1st century, the Romans choose this place, Eboracum, as a permanent legionary fortress. The site controls routes north and west. It sits on navigable water. It can be supplied by ship and road. A legion stationed here is a fist held under the chin of the island, with ramparts, gates, granaries, workshops, and a civilian settlement, the Canabi, sprawling just outside the walls. Archaeology and inscriptions tie the Ninth closely to Eboracum. Stones bearing names of officers, altars dedicated to gods, and countless stamped building materials tell us that the Legion didn't just fight in Britain, it built Britain's Roman framework. When you see a tile stamped Legio IX Hisp, you're looking at the administrative side of conquest, standardized production, organized labor, and the quiet certainty that Rome intends to stay. The decades after Boudica are a constant push and pull along the frontier. Governors come and go. Some are cautious managers. Others are ambitious hunters of glory. Under leaders like Petilius Cerealis, now returned to Britain in a higher role, and later Agricola, Roman forces press northward. They build marching camps that appear like clockwork across the landscape, then vanish, leaving only a faint rectangle in the soil. They negotiate with tribes one season and raid them the next. The Ninth, based at York, is perfectly placed to spearhead or support these operations. For the soldiers, life is a mix of routine and sudden danger. One week you are laying stones, measuring angles with a surveyor's rod, and shouting at mules. The next, you are trudging through rain toward an enemy who refuses to stand in the open. Northern Britain is not like the sunny propaganda of Rome. It is bog, heather, and the feeling that the land itself is watching you. And yet, through all this, the Ninth remains visible. Its name appears in the record. Its commanders are known. Its presence makes sense. That is why the later disappearance feels so unnatural. When a legion is active, it leaves traces. It writes itself into the landscape. So here is the key question we carry forward. What is the last moment when we can say, with confidence, the Ninth was here? In Part 6, we start assembling the hard evidence, inscriptions, tile stamps, and official lists, to find the Ninth's final footprints. The mystery won't be solved in one dramatic revelation. It will be narrowed, stone by stone. When historians chase the lost Ninth, they don't begin with rumors. They begin with stones. Roman Britain, unlike many provinces, left behind a surprisingly rich epigraphic record. Altars, tombstones, dedication plaques, and the humble but invaluable tile stamp. These objects are not novels. They are administrative receipts, and that makes them precious. At York, one of the most important clues is a building inscription associated with the legion. Romans often dated such inscriptions by naming the consuls of the year, an official timestamp, like writing 2026 on a cornerstone. From this kind of evidence, the ninth is firmly attested in Eboracum into the reign of Trajan, around the first decade of the 2nd century. In other words, the legion survives Boudica. It survives decades of northern campaigning. It is still, unmistakably, a living unit in Britain. Then the trail begins to thin. After those early 2nd century attestations, the ninth's name becomes harder to find in Britain. That might not sound dramatic. After all, not every year produces inscriptions, but compare it to other legions. When a legion remains stationed somewhere for decades, it tends to keep leaving marks, repairs, dedications, tombstones for men who die far from home. The sudden quiet around the ninth is what raises eyebrows. We also have a different kind of evidence, later references to which legions exist and where they're stationed. These come from inscriptions, official documents like military diplomas, and occasional literary hints. They are incomplete, and they can lag behind reality. Bureaucracies are not famous for real-time accuracy, but they help us see patterns. By the time Hadrian visits Britain in AD 122 and orders a great wall across the island, we hear clearly of other legions in the province. We do not hear clearly of the ninth. Here is where the mystery becomes sharp. Not mentioned is not the same as destroyed. A unit can be transferred, renamed, merged, or quietly rebuilt under a different title. But the ninth is a famous number, and its nickname is distinctive. If it continued to exist in the same way, we would expect at least a whisper. So our investigation turns from Britain outward. If the ninth leaves Britain, where could it go? There are two frontiers that constantly demanded manpower: the Rhine in the northwest of the empire, and the eastern provinces, where Rome faced rival powers and frequent revolt. In Part 7, we follow the evidence across the sea, toward the Rhine frontier, where an unexpected cluster of clues appears, and where the ninth may have lived longer than Britain's silence suggests. If Britain goes quiet, the Rhine suddenly speaks. On the lower Rhine, near modern Nijmegen in the Netherlands, archaeologists have found tiles stamped with the mark of the ninth, Legio IX Hisp. At first glance, this looks like the missing piece, proof that the legion was transferred from Britain to the continental frontier. And it would make strategic sense. The Rhine was Rome's traditional fault line, a place where Germanic coalitions could flare into war, where forts needed rebuilding, and where emperors liked to be seen, because the army there could make or break a reign. But history is never that simple. A tile stamp tells you that the legion's administrative machinery was present where the tile was made. It does not, by itself, tell you the exact year. Tiles can be stockpiled. They can be moved. They can even be reused in later construction. So the argument hinges on context, the layers in which the tiles were found, the dating of associated materials, and whether the fort phases at Nijmegen matched the period when the ninth would plausibly be there. Many researchers have taken Nijmegen seriously because the concentration of ninth material feels more than accidental. It is not one stray brick carried by chance. It is an industrial signature. If the ninth was indeed stationed or at least active there, then the vanishing in Scotland story cannot be the whole picture. The legion would have survived long enough to cross back to the continent and to put its stamp, literally, into the Rhine frontier's infrastructure. Why would Rome move a legion from Britain? Consider the wider empire under Trajan and Hadrian. Troops were constantly shuffled to meet needs. Dacia, Parthia, the Danube, the Rhine. Britain, once the headline conquest, could begin to look like a garrison province, while the Rhine demanded fresh strength. A transfer would be a perfectly Roman solution, pragmatic, quiet, and recorded only in the traces that survive by accident. Yet there's a catch. Even if the ninth reached Nijmegen, it still disappears from later, clearer snapshots of the Roman army. By the mid-2nd century, when we can list most legions with reasonable confidence, the ninth is not among them. Something happens between present on the Rhine and gone from the imperial order of battle. So Nijmegen may not solve the mystery. It may simply move it. In Part 8, we tackle the most famous theory head-on, the idea that the ninth was annihilated in the far north of Britain. What evidence supports that story, and what evidence quietly undermines it? The Lost in Scotland narrative has a powerful grip on the imagination, and for good reason. The geography invites it. North of York, the landscape tightens into hills and bogs, and then opens into the harsher spaces of what the Romans called Caledonia. It is easy to picture a legion marching beyond the last safe forts, stretched out along a roadless track, with rain turning the ground to glue, and then an ambush erupting from trees and heather. Historically, Rome did fight hard in the north. Agricola pushed deep into Scotland in the late 1st century, and later emperors faced periodic revolts and raids. We know that Hadrian, early in his reign, comes to Britain and orders a wall, an enormous statement that the frontier must be fixed and controlled. The wall itself is not proof of a massacre, but it does suggest instability serious enough to reshape policy. Supporters of the Caledonian destruction theory often point to two observations. First, the ninth's name fades in Britain after the early 2nd century. Second, later, another legion, 6 Victrix, is brought into Britain and based at York. If 6 replaces 9, the argument goes, then 9 must have been removed by catastrophe, because Rome does not casually swap legions without reason. There is also a tantalizing literary hint from the 2nd century, a remark in a letter by the rhetorician Fronto, speaking of heavy Roman losses in Britain under Hadrian. It is not a detailed battle report. It names no legion, but it reminds us that the island could still bite, and bite hard. Yet when we put the theory under a cold light, problems appear. Roman authors could be discreet, but they were not always silent about disasters. The annihilation of 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest, for example, becomes famous. A full legion lost in Britain, especially if its eagle were captured, would be the kind of humiliation later writers might relish. The absence of a clear ancient account is not fatal to the theory, but it forces us to rely on inference rather than testimony. An inference cuts both ways. If the 9th was destroyed in Scotland, why do we find its stamped materials at Nijmegen? Are those tiles misdated, reused, or misunderstood? Or does the Rhine evidence mean the legion survived long enough to leave Britain? A legion can also disappear administratively without being wiped out on a battlefield. It can be broken up, its survivors drafted into other units, its number retired to erase an embarrassment. Rome could lose men without losing the paperwork in a way that leaves a neat headline. So the Caledonian theory is possible. It is cinematic, but it is not yet proven. In Part 9, we shift the scene to the Rhine frontier and ask a different question. If the 9th left Britain alive, what wars on the continent could have finished it, quietly, efficiently, and far from the fog of Caledonia? The Rhine frontier is often imagined as a static wall of forts facing an endless forest. In reality, it was a living border economy, river patrols, customs stations, trade, diplomacy, and, when diplomacy failed, sudden violence. A legion stationed near Nijmegen would not spend its days heroically charging barbarians. It would build, drill, guard, and wait, until the moment waiting ended. If the 9th reached the Rhine, several paths open. One is simple attrition. Legions could be bled white by repeated small wars, raids, punitive expeditions, sieges of hill forts, none of which make it into grand histories. Another is redeployment. The Rhine was a reservoir of trained manpower. Emperors pulled units from there to fight bigger, more politically important wars elsewhere, then pushed other units back to fill the gap. Think of Trajan's reign, with its aggressive campaigns. Dacia on the Danube demanded huge resources. Later, the Eastern War against Parthia stretched Roman logistics to the limit. Even if the 9th's last British inscriptions date to Trajan's early years, it is entirely plausible that the legion, or large detachments from it, were sucked into these wider conflicts. Roman armies were modular. A legion could be in Britain on paper while sending thousands of men to fight somewhere else, returning as veterans, or not returning at all. Could the 9th have been destroyed on the Rhine itself? The record gives us no clear catastrophe on the scale of Teutoburg in this period, but that is precisely the point. Absence of drama can hide real loss. A legion might be shattered in a hard campaign, its survivors spread among other units, and the number quietly retired. If the emperor preferred not to advertise weakness, the official story could be simple: administrative reorganization. There is also another, subtler possibility. The 9th's disappearance may reflect not one final battle, but a decision. to erase a unit whose history had become inconvenient. Roman political memory was selective. Emperors celebrated victories and smoothed over defeats. A legion that repeatedly suffered embarrassing reverses, first in Boudicca's revolt, later perhaps in another disaster, could become a symbol nobody wanted to keep. But again, the Rhine theory runs into the same hard wall as the Caledonian one. We need a mechanism. We need a moment, a conflict, or at least a strong context that explains why the ninth vanishes from later lists while other legions remain visible. So we widen the lens one more time. If a legion disappears without loud explanation, one of the likeliest places is the East, where Rome fought costly wars and faced rebellions it struggled to control, and where records are patchier. In Part 10, we travel to the empire's far side and ask whether the lost ninth met its end under a very different sun. If you were an emperor looking for trouble, you did not have to invent it. You simply looked east. Beyond the Mediterranean lay provinces rich, tense, and often restless. Beyond them lay rival powers. First Parthia, later the early forms of Persia, states that could field cavalry armies and play a long game. The eastern frontier was Rome's other heartbeat, and it sometimes beat irregularly. This is where a different theory for the ninth's fate takes root, that the legion was transferred east and destroyed there, far from the epigraphic habits of Britain and the Rhine. The attraction of this idea is not just romance. It's pattern. We know that at least one legion, XXI Deuteriana, seems to vanish from the record in the 2nd century under circumstances that may involve the East. If one legion can fade away there, why not another? The strongest candidate event is the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea, AD 132 to 135. This was not a quick uprising. It was a grinding, violent war that forced Rome to concentrate enormous forces. Ancient sources speak of severe Roman casualties. The province was devastated, the political response was harsh, and the memory of the conflict was uncomfortable enough that later accounts often feel clipped, even evasive. In such a war, a legion could be mauled, broken, and then absorbed into other units. If the ninth had been available, freed from Britain or the Rhine, it could have been sent as reinforcement. But notice the careful language. Could have. The problem is evidence. In the East, we have inscriptions, but not in the same density as Britain's military zones. We also have named legions that are clearly present in Judea and Syria. Exfertensis is a famous one, for example, and the ninth is not among the obvious, securely attested participants. That absence might mean the ninth was never there, or it might mean the ninth arrived, suffered, and left little trace because it did not remain to build in stone. Another Eastern possibility is earlier, Trajan's campaigns against Parthia and the turmoil that followed. Roman forces advanced deep, then pulled back, while revolts flickered behind them. Detachments were scattered across enormous distances. A legion fighting and marching in such conditions could be chewed up by disease, desertion, and local resistance as effectively as by pitched battle. So the Eastern theory is plausible, and it has a certain grim logic. But it remains, at best, an explanation that fits a gap, not a solution that stands on firm ground. In Part 11, we return to the evidence we can actually hold in our hands, and we ask a practical question. What exactly do the Nijmegen finds prove, and what do they only suggest? The answer may decide whether the ninth died in Britain or lived long enough to die elsewhere. Let's slow down and treat Nijmegen like a crime scene. A stamp tile is a clue, but like a fingerprint on a doorknob, it tells you contact, not motive. To turn that clue into a timeline, archaeologists ask 3 questions. Where was it found? What was it found with? And what building phase does that layer belong to? At Nijmegen, the Roman military presence goes through multiple phases: wooden forts, rebuilding, expansion, and the inevitable repairs that follow floods, fires, and neglect. Coins help date layers because they have emperors' portraits and known minting ranges. Pottery styles shift over decades like fashion. In some cases, timber posts can be dated by tree rings. When a stamp tile appears in a clearly dated construction layer, its value as evidence rises sharply. This is why scholars argue. Some interpret the ninth's stamped material as belonging to an early 2nd century building phase, suggesting that the legion, or at least a large detachment, a vexillatio, was operating on the Rhine around the time Britain's record grows quiet. Others warn that tiles can travel in time, reused in later repairs, dumped as rubble, or incorporated into secondary contexts that look later than the tile's original manufacture. There is also the detachment problem. Rome frequently split legions. A governor in Britain could send a few cohorts to the continent for a season, especially if the emperor demanded manpower. Those men might produce or supervise building materials stamped with their legion's mark, without the entire legion ever relocating. If that happened, it would explain how the Ninth leaves traces on the Rhine while still appearing in a British inscription as stationed at York. So what can we responsibly say? The Nijmegen evidence makes it harder to claim that the Ninth must have been annihilated in Britain immediately after its last York inscription. It suggests mobility. It hints that, at minimum, the Ninth's administrative identity reached the Rhine in the early 2nd century. Whether that means the whole legion moved, or only a substantial part of it did, is the open question. And this brings us to another solid fact. At some point, the 6th Legion, 6 Victrix, is placed at York. That is not a casual choice. Legions were expensive, political tools. Moving one was a major decision. In Part 12, we examine the moment Britain changes course, Hadrian's visit, the building of his wall, and the arrival of 6 Victrix. Because when you see a new legion take an old legion's seat, you are watching an imperial response. The question is, a response to what? When Hadrian comes to Britain, he comes as an organizer, not a conqueror. He is the emperor who travels, inspects, and redraws the empire's edges with a surveyor's eye. Around AD 122, he orders a wall across northern Britain, stone, turf, mile castles, forts, a military landscape designed to control movement and to declare, loudly, that Rome has decided where the world ends. 3 legions are traditionally associated with the wall's construction: 2 Augusta, XX Valeria Victrix, and 6 Victrix. The last of these is our key. 6 Victrix is not a British veteran. It arrives from the continent and takes up residence at York, the very fortress long linked with the Ninth. In practical terms, York is too important to leave under strength. It anchors the north. It watches the road network. If Rome sends a fresh legion there, it is because Rome wants certainty. Was 6 sent because the Ninth had been destroyed? That is one interpretation, and it fits the emotional logic of empire. You lose a legion, you replace it. But replacement can also mean rotation. Legions were moved to spread experience, to prevent local entanglements, and to respond to new priorities. Hadrian could have decided that Britain needed a stronger or more reliable unit, or simply that the Ninth was needed elsewhere. Here is the uncomfortable truth. A wall does not automatically imply defeat. A wall can be a sign of strength, a sign of strategy, or a sign of exhaustion. Hadrian's policy often favored consolidation. He abandoned some of Trajan's eastern gains. He fortified frontiers. In that context, the wall could represent a shift from expansion into Caledonia to a more controlled border economy. The Ninth's disappearance could be part of that administrative rearrangement, not evidence of a massacre. And yet, the timing gnaws at us. Britain in the early 2nd century seems troubled. Sources hint at unrest. Troops are concentrated. A major building project is launched. A new legion arrives. These are not random events. They form a cluster, the sort historians circle on a timeline and label, cautiously, crisis. So we are left with 2 competing pictures. In one, the Ninth dies in the north, and 6 marches in to fill the empty space. In the other, the Ninth is moved out, perhaps to the Rhine, perhaps farther, and 6 arrives as part of a broader reshuffle and frontier policy. In Part 13, we examine a final, often overlooked angle: how Rome handled bad news. If a legion was destroyed, would the empire always admit it? Or could the Ninth have been erased not by swords, but by administration, by the politics of memory? We tend to imagine Rome as a marble archive, everything written down, stored, preserved. In reality, Roman administration was vast but fragile. Most military paperwork was on wood, wax, or papyrus, materials that rot, burn, and vanish. What survives is skewed. Inscriptions carved in stone, texts copied by medieval scribes who chose what to preserve, and the occasional scrap rescued from desert sand. That matters because the Ninth disappears, might be less like a magician's trick and more like a library fire. A legion could continue for years, and we might still lose the evidence, especially if it moved into regions where fewer inscriptions were carved or where later building reused older stone. But Rome also shaped memory deliberately. Emperors curated their image. They celebrated victories and quietly stepped around defeats. In extreme cases, they practiced damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, scraping names from monuments, melting down statues, rewriting the public record. That was usually aimed at individuals, not entire legions. But the principle is relevant. Rome understood that what is not recorded can, in time, be treated as if it never happened. Legions, too, could be punished. Units that mutinied or performed poorly might be renamed, split, or disbanded. Sometimes a legion's number could be retired to avoid bad associations. The Roman army was conservative, but it was not sentimental. A number was useful only as long as it served the emperor's needs. Imagine a scenario where the ninth suffers a serious defeat, whether in Britain, on the Rhine, or in the East, but not one spectacular enough to become legend. The emperor rebuilds the frontier, redistributes survivors into other units, and quietly stops using the ninth's title. No triumphal arch, no commemorative history, just administrative silence. From the center of power, that is rational. From our perspective, 2,000 years later, it looks like mystery. This is why competing theories can coexist without one crushing the others. The evidence is not a single chain, it is a patchwork. One inscription can survive while 10 others crumble. One fort can be excavated while another lies under a modern city. A single stamp tile can carry more weight than it deserves, simply because it is all we have. So, if we want an honest conclusion, we have to be comfortable with probability instead of certainty. Which explanation best fits the surviving traces? Which requires the fewest special assumptions? In Part 14, we'll weigh the theories side by side, like a historian's verdict, Scotland, Rhine, or East, and what each one would imply about Rome's wars, its bureaucracy, and its willingness to let a legion disappear without a headline. Let's put our three main explanations on the table and ask, plainly, what each one needs in order to be true. Theory 1. Annihilation in northern Britain. Its strength is narrative and geography. We know Britain could produce sudden, deadly rebellion. We know the ninth's name fades in Britain. We know a new legion later occupies York. To make this theory work, however, we must accept that a full legion was destroyed without a clear ancient report naming it. And we must treat the Nijmegen material as misdated, reused, or unrelated to the legion's later life. That is possible, but it asks us to explain away evidence rather than build on it. Theory 2. Transfer to the Rhine. Its strength is the Nijmegen stamp trail and the strategic logic of moving troops where they're needed. It also fits the Roman habit of redeployment and the modular use of detachments. To make this theory work, we do not need a dramatic British catastrophe. We simply need an administrative decision. The ninth leaves York, and 6 Victrix takes its place. The weakness is that it still doesn't tell us how the ninth dies. It shifts the disappearance to a different frontier, but the end remains offstage. Theory 3. Death in the East. Its strength is that the East is where Rome fought costly, politically complicated wars, places where losses could be heavy and where the surviving record is uneven. It also has parallels in other units that seem to fade from view in the 2nd century. To make it work, we must accept a transfer chain. Britain to continent, continent to east, and then destruction or dissolution. The weakness is the same as before. We lack a clear inscription or author saying, the ninth was here, and it was destroyed. So what is the most responsible conclusion? Many modern historians lean toward a combined explanation. The ninth likely survived its British service into the early 2nd century, and it may have been redeployed, perhaps to the Rhine, perhaps onward, before disappearing sometime before the mid-2nd century snapshots, where it is no longer listed. That view doesn't solve the final battle, but it respects the hard evidence, the last secure traces in Britain, the Rhine hints, and the later absence. In other words, the ninth may not have vanished like a ghost. It may have been absorbed by the machinery of empire, moved, worn down, reorganized, and finally erased from the roster. But the mystery is not a failure. It is a lesson in how the ancient world reaches us, imperfectly, unevenly, like a mosaic with missing tiles. In part 15, we close by returning to that misty road in the north, and we'll ask what the lost ninth reveals about Rome's power and about our own hunger for answers when the past refuses to speak. So, where did the Ninth Legion go? If you were hoping for a single name, a single battlefield, and a neat ending, the past will disappoint you. The Lost Ninth is not one story. It is the overlap of several possible stories, all pressed together by the weight of missing evidence. We can say a few things with confidence. The Ninth is real. It fights for Rome. It suffers terribly in Boudicca's revolt and is rebuilt. It is stationed at York, shaping the Roman north with bricks, roads, and discipline. Into the early 2nd century, its name still appears, still official, still alive. And then, somewhere between those last firm footprints and the later period when other legions stand clearly in the record, the Ninth stops being a legion we can point to. If the Ninth died in Britain, it died in a province capable of sudden violence, and it died in a landscape that could swallow an army and reign in silence. If it died on the Rhine, it died on a frontier that rarely offered glory, only work, vigilance, and occasional catastrophe. If it died in the East, it died under a harsher sun, in wars where Rome paid dearly for control, and where memory itself could be treated as a political problem. What I find most haunting is not the lack of an ending, but the way the ending could be ordinary. A legion could be reduced by casualties, replenished with new recruits, reduced again, and then quietly dissolved, its veterans reassigned, its eagle retired, its number dropped from future lists. The empire rolls on. A new legion takes the old fortress. The wall rises. Life continues. And only much later do we, looking back, feel the absence like a missing tooth. There is a temptation to fill the gap with certainty, because certainty feels like closure. But history is often truer when it admits its seams. The Ninth teaches us to respect those seams, to distinguish what we know from what we suspect, and to enjoy the suspense without mistaking it for proof. If you've stayed with this story, you've already done something rare. You've watched the past the way a historian watches it, patiently, with curiosity and restraint. And that, in its own way, is a kind of victory over the fog. If you'd like, tell me which theory convinces you most, Scotland, the Rhine, or the East, and why. The best discussions often begin where the sources fall silent. Next time you see a Roman ruin, an altar stone, a fragment of tile, remember that it may be the last surviving word of thousands of lives. Somewhere, on some cold morning, the Ninth marched. The mist closed, and the empire, for once, did not leave us a clear map back.